Criminal returns from death with a terrifying message from heaven. The night was dark, a veil of ominous clouds smothering the city skyline. Damien Wolfe, a man whose name struck fear into the hearts of many, hurtled through the streets in a stolen car, its tires shrieking against the pavement. The wail of police sirens echoed behind him, a cacophony of sound chasing him like a pack of wolves after wounded prey. Damien's face was a mask of determination, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he weaved through traffic, narrowly avoiding collisions with startled drivers. He had lived his life on the edge, always one step ahead of the law, always laughing in the face of danger. But tonight felt different. There was no exhilaration, no thrill in the chase. The weight of his actions seemed heavier than usual. The faces of his victims, people he had robbed, betrayed, and even killed, flickered in his mind like ghostly apparitions. For a moment, his grip faltered, the car swerving slightly before he corrected its path. "Get it together," he muttered to himself, but his voice carried a tremor he didn't recognize. He had always been the predator, never the prey. Yet tonight, as the city lights blurred past him, Damien felt hunted, not just by the police, but by something far greater, something unseen. The police barricade loomed ahead, a wall of flashing lights and officers with weapons drawn. Damien gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He had escaped worse. His options were limited: stop and face justice, or risk everything in one desperate gamble. The decision was made in an instant. Damien pressed the accelerator to the floor, the engine roaring as the car surged forward like a bullet. The crash was deafening. Metal screamed against metal as Damien's car plowed through the barricade, flipping end over end before coming to rest in a mangled heap. Smoke billowed from the wreckage, mingling with the faint scent of gasoline. Officers approached cautiously, weapons still drawn, but it was clear Damien was no longer a threat. His body lay limp, his head slumped against the steering wheel. Blood trickled down his face, pooling on the shattered glass that covered the dashboard. Paramedics arrived moments later, their faces grim as they assessed the scene. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, checked for a pulse. Her fingers pressed against his neck, her expression darkening as she looked up at her partner and shook her head. "He's gone," she said softly. The news spread quickly. Damien Wolfe, the city's most notorious criminal, was dead. The officers who had pursued him exchanged glances, their relief mingled with disbelief. The reign of terror was over, or so they thought. At the morgue, the atmosphere was sterile and quiet. Damien's body lay on a metal table, a stark contrast to the chaos he had sown in life. The coroner, a grizzled man named Victor, prepared for the autopsy with practiced efficiency. He had seen countless bodies over the years, each with its own story of tragedy and violence. Damien was just another name, another statistic, or so it seemed. Victor reached for his scalpel, ready to make the first incision, when a sound froze him in place. A faint, wheezing gasp echoed through the room. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the body. It had to be his imagination. But then it came again, louder this time. A gurgling, rasping sound, like air struggling to push through constricted lungs. Victor stepped closer, his heart pounding. He leaned over Damien's body, his eyes fixed on the man's chest. To his astonishment, he saw a faint rise and fall. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's impossible." Before he could process what was happening, Damien's eyes snapped open. They were wide and wild, filled with a terror so profound it made Victor stumble back. Damien's mouth opened in a silent scream, his hands clawing at the air as if trying to fend off an invisible attacker. "Help me," he croaked, his voice raw and desperate. "They sent me back. You don't understand. They sent me back." Victor stared, frozen in place. His rational mind fought to make sense of the impossible, but every fiber of his being told him he was witnessing something beyond comprehension. Damien's body convulsed, his limbs thrashing as if he were wrestling with some unseen force. The door burst open, and 2 nurses rushed in, their faces pale. "What's going on?" one of them demanded, her voice trembling. "He was dead," Victor stammered. "He was dead. But now..." Damien let out a guttural scream that silenced them all. His eyes darted around the room, wild and unfocused. "You don't know what's out there," he gasped. "You don't know what I've seen. They're coming for us. No one is safe." The nurses exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to restrain him or call for help. But Damien's strength seemed to wane as quickly as it had surged. His body sagged against the table, his breathing shallow but steady. His eyes, however, remained wide, staring at something none of them could see. "They showed me everything," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Every sin, every soul I've destroyed. They made me feel it. The pain, the fear, the loss. It's all real. And they're watching us." Victor swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he stepped closer. "Who's watching, Damien?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Damien's gaze locked onto Victor, his eyes brimming with a terror that seemed to pierce the soul. "The light," he said hoarsely. "It wasn't heaven. It wasn't hell. It was something else. They don't forgive. They don't forget. They sent me back to warn you." As the words left his lips, the room seemed to grow colder, an unnatural chill seeping into their bones. Victor and the nurses stood in stunned silence, the weight of Damien's proclamation hanging heavy in the air. The man who had cheated death had returned, not as a man seeking redemption, but as a harbinger of something far more terrifying. The hospital room was small and stark, with pale green walls that seemed to absorb every flicker of light. The hum of machines punctuated the eerie silence, a monotonous reminder that life clung to Damien Wolfe by a thread. Though he was awake, his eyes were hollow, unfocused, as if he was seeing something beyond the room's confines. Nurses came and went, their conversations whispered, their gazes a mix of wariness and curiosity. The miracle of his survival was overshadowed by the strange things he had been saying. Damien refused food, refused sleep. Every time his eyelids began to droop, he would jolt awake, gasping and clawing at the air like a drowning man. "They'll take me back," he muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse and cracking. "If I sleep, they'll take me back." No one could make sense of his ravings. He spoke of the light, of the Watchers, and of something he referred to only as the reckoning. The nurses chalked it up to trauma, both physical and psychological. But even the hospital's psychiatrist, Dr. Ellen Park, found herself unsettled during her sessions with him. "Damien," she said gently during one visit, sitting across from him with a clipboard in hand. "Can you tell me what you're afraid of? What do you think will happen if you fall asleep?" Damien's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto hers. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm not afraid of dying. I've been there already. I'm afraid of what comes after." Dr. Park frowned slightly, her pen hovering over the clipboard. You said you've been there. Where, exactly, is there? He leaned forward, his restraints clinking softly against the bed rails. I thought it was hell, he whispered, his voice trembling. I thought that's where I'd end up, but it wasn't. It was brighter. So bright it burned. It was everywhere, and it was alive. Dr. Park tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. Alive? Damien nodded, his breath quickening. The light wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It was judgment. It ripped through me, showed me every second of my life. Every moment I hurt someone, every lie I told, every sin I committed, it was all laid bare. And I felt it, Doctor. I felt their pain as if it was my own. All at once. It was endless. For the first time in her career, Dr. Park felt a chill run down her spine during a patient session. Damien's voice was filled with such raw emotion, such genuine fear, that it was hard to dismiss his words as mere hallucinations. But she maintained her professional composure. Damien, she said carefully, if this light judged you, why do you think it sent you back? Why are you here now? His gaze dropped to his hands, which trembled uncontrollably. That's the part that scares me the most, he said after a long pause. They didn't send me back to save me. They didn't send me back to forgive me. They sent me back with a message. For all of us. Before Dr. Park could press him further, there was a knock at the door. A nurse entered, followed by Julia Morales, a determined-looking journalist who had been trying for days to secure an interview with Damien. Dr. Park frowned, annoyed by the intrusion, but Julia held up her press badge. Sorry to interrupt, Doctor, Julia said, her tone polite but firm. I think he might be ready to talk to me now. Dr. Park hesitated, glancing at Damien, who had gone quiet again, staring at the floor. To her surprise, he gave a slight nod. Let her in, he murmured. She needs to hear this. Julia sat down cautiously, her notebook and recorder ready. She had followed Damien's criminal career for years, covering his exploits with a mix of fascination and revulsion. But the man before her now was a far cry from the arrogant, untouchable figure she remembered. He looked broken, haunted, as though the weight of his experiences was too much to bear. Damien, she began, her voice softer than usual. What happened to you? What did you see? He stared at her for a long moment, as if debating whether to speak. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. When I died, he said slowly, I didn't just see my life flash before my eyes. I lived it all again. Every terrible thing I'd done, every person I'd hurt. It wasn't like watching a movie. It was real. I was them. I felt their fear, their anger, their pain. Julia leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. And then what? Damien's expression darkened, and then I saw them. Them? He nodded, swallowing hard. The Watchers. They were there in the light. They didn't speak, but I knew what they wanted. They showed me something terrible, and then they said, You're not done yet. Julia's brow furrowed. What did they show you? Damien's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. A scroll, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It was covered in names. Names of people. I don't know how I knew, but it wasn't a list of the dead. It was a list of the living. And I'm on it. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Julia exchanged a glance with Dr. Park, who looked equally unsettled. The journalist took a deep breath, pressing forward. "What do you think this list means, Damien?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I think it's a warning," he said. "The Watchers aren't angels. They're not here to save us. They're here to make sure we face the consequences of what we've done. And when the last name on that scroll is crossed off, it'll be too late." Julia felt a shiver crawl down her spine. She had interviewed countless people in her career, liars, cheats, and manipulators. But Damien's conviction was unnerving. He believed every word he was saying, and somehow that made it worse. "Do you think there's a way to stop it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Damien's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "Stop it?" he echoed. "You don't stop them. You can only prepare, and you better hope your name's not on that list." For the first time in her life, Julia found herself at a loss for words. The man who had once been a monster now sat before her, warning of a far greater threat. Whether she believed him or not, one thing was certain. Damien Wolf had returned from death, and he was no longer the same. The rumors spread like wildfire, seeping into every corner of the city. Damien Wolf, the man everyone thought they were finally rid of, was back, and he was far from the same. The headlines were sensational. "Criminal cheated death. Claims he has a message from the beyond." But the details remained shrouded in mystery. Some believed it was a hoax, orchestrated by a desperate man to avoid justice. Others whispered about divine intervention, a miraculous act to reform a sinner. Most, however, simply dismissed it as madness. Damien himself was oblivious to the speculation. Confined to his hospital room, he spent his days staring out the window, his lips moving in silent conversation with someone or something that no one else could see. Nurses avoided his room unless absolutely necessary, unnerved by his mutterings and his tendency to fix them with a gaze that seemed to pierce their very souls. Julia Morales, the journalist who had managed to speak with him, found herself unable to shake their conversation. She replayed his words in her mind, turning them over and over, searching for logic in what felt like the ravings of a madman. Yet, there was a conviction in his voice, a sincerity that gnawed at her skepticism. She had seen liars before, politicians, criminals, even grieving family members twisting truths for their own benefit. Damien didn't fit the mold. He wasn't trying to convince her. He was trying to warn her. Unable to let it go, Julia began digging deeper. She scoured records of near-death experiences, searching for parallels to Damien's claims. Stories of tunnels of light, life reviews, and encounters with angelic or demonic beings were abundant, but none described the Watchers or the ominous scroll he had mentioned. The more she read, the more questions arose. What exactly had Damien seen? And why did he believe it wasn't over? Her curiosity soon turned into an obsession. She reached out to spiritual leaders, psychologists, and even fringe theorists, hoping to find someone who could make sense of Damien's experience. Most dismissed her inquiries, but one response stood out, a cryptic email from a professor of comparative religion at a nearby university. The professor, Dr. Elias Kane, invited Julia to his office. "You mentioned Watchers," he said as she sat across from him, his voice low and cautious. "That term isn't unique to Damien Wolf's experience. It has roots in ancient texts, specifically in apocryphal writings like the Book of Enoch." Julia leaned forward, intrigued. "What are they?" Dr. Kane adjusted his glasses, his expression grave. "The Watchers are said to be a class of celestial beings, neither wholly angelic nor demonic. They observe humanity, recording our actions. Some traditions suggest they are judges, ensuring that divine justice is carried out. Others describe them as neutral observers, bound by a higher power to remain silent. If Damien truly encountered such beings, it's no wonder he's disturbed. Julia frowned. But why would they send him back? What's the purpose of the message he claims to carry? That, Dr. Kane said, is the most troubling part. If the Watchers are involved, it could mean humanity is being weighed and found wanting. His description of the scroll is particularly chilling. In many traditions, a divine scroll is a symbol of judgment, containing the names of the righteous and the condemned. If Damien is telling the truth, it may not be his life alone that hangs in the balance. The weight of the professor's words left Julia silent, her pen hovering over her notebook. After a moment, she asked, "Have you ever heard of anyone else experiencing something like this?" Dr. Kane hesitated and then nodded. Rarely, but yes. Most cases involve individuals who claim to have been warned about impending disasters, earthquakes, wars, even personal tragedies. In almost every instance, their warnings are ignored, often dismissed as the ramblings of the unhinged. Julia's stomach churned. And if they're not ignored? Kane's gaze darkened. Then, perhaps those warnings serve as an opportunity for repentance, for change. But the message Damien carries, it sounds more like a verdict than a warning. Meanwhile, Damien's behavior in the hospital grew more erratic. He refused to speak with anyone other than Julia, and even then, his answers were cryptic at best. He spent hours scribbling on scraps of paper, filling them with symbols and words that made little sense. One nurse, who dared to peek at his writings, described them as nonsensical ramblings. But Julia thought differently when she finally got a look. Among the chaotic scribbles were detailed drawings of figures bathed in light, their faces obscured, and a scroll with endless lines of tiny, unreadable text. When she questioned him about it, Damien's response was chilling. "It's not just about me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about everyone. The list grows shorter every day. They're watching all of us." Julia tried to press him for more details, but he refused to elaborate. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered, his eyes darting to a corner of the room. "They're here." Julia followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Still, the air in the room felt heavier, colder. She shivered, brushing it off as her imagination. Word of Damien's claims began to attract attention outside the hospital. Thrill seekers, conspiracy theorists, and even religious zealots gathered outside, chanting, praying, or simply gawking. Security had to be tightened to prevent anyone from breaking in. The hospital administrators debated transferring Damien to a psychiatric facility, but no one wanted the responsibility of handling such a high-profile and controversial patient. One night, the tension reached a breaking point. Damien's screams shattered the silence, echoing through the halls. By the time nurses and orderlies reached his room, they found him crouched in a corner, his arms wrapped around his knees, his body trembling. The restraints that had been securely fastened to his bed were inexplicably undone. "They're angry," he said, his voice shaking. "They're tired of waiting." The staff tried to calm him, but Damien refused to return to his bed. He pointed to the window, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't you see them? They're everywhere. They're waiting for the scroll to open." When Julia arrived the next morning, she found Damien restrained once more, his energy drained, but his fear undiminished. She sat by his bedside, unsure of what to say. "Julia," he murmured, his voice hoarse, "I'm running out of time. We're all running out of time." She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "What can I do, Damien? How can I help?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You can't help me, but you can warn them. Tell them what's coming. They won't believe you, but tell them anyway." His words sent a shiver down her spine. Julia didn't believe in miracles or divine messages, but Damien's conviction was unshakable. She left the hospital that day with a sense of unease that wouldn't fade, haunted by the idea that the watchers might not just be watching Damien, but everyone. Damien Wolfe vanished from the hospital on a rainy, moonless night. The security cameras recorded his escape, but the footage only deepened the mystery. One moment, he was restrained in his bed, sedated after another one of his outbursts. The next, the camera feed flickered, and he was gone. No alarms sounded, no doors were forced open, and no one could explain how he managed to get past the locked ward and multiple guards stationed outside his room. By morning, the city was in an uproar. The hospital staff, already uneasy about his strange claims and erratic behavior, scrambled to contain the fallout. Reporters swarmed the building, eager to uncover the latest twist in what had become a national sensation. Religious leaders condemned the incident as a failure to heed divine warnings, while skeptics dismissed it as nothing more than the ramblings of a disturbed mind. But for Julia Morales, the disappearance was a turning point. She couldn't shake the feeling that Damien's warnings, as far-fetched as they seemed, might hold some truth. Julia's first instinct was to revisit his words, combing through her notes and the recordings of their conversations. The phrase that haunted her most was, "The sins must be repaid." It echoed in her mind as she considered the growing unease that seemed to ripple through the city. There had been reports of strange phenomena, lights in the sky, sudden power outages, and an increase in vivid, unexplainable nightmares among those who had crossed paths with Damien. People whispered of seeing shadowy figures out of the corners of their eyes, figures that disappeared the moment they turned their heads. The air itself felt heavier, charged with an unseen tension. 2 days after his escape, Julia received an anonymous tip. A crumpled note was slipped under her apartment door, written in a frantic scrawl she recognized immediately. It was Damien's handwriting. "Find me at St. Mark's Church. They're getting closer. Hurry." The church in question was an abandoned relic on the outskirts of the city, long forgotten by the bustling metropolis that had grown around it. Its peeling paint and shattered stained glass windows made it a refuge for squatters and stray animals, not divine encounters. Still, Julia didn't hesitate. She grabbed her recorder, a flashlight, and her notebook, then set out for the church in the pouring rain. By the time she arrived, the storm had intensified, the wind howling like a living thing. The heavy wooden doors of the church creaked ominously as she pushed them open, revealing a cavernous interior lit only by flashes of lightning. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. At first, she thought the church was empty, but then she saw him. Damien was crouched in the center of the nave, surrounded by a chaotic swirl of candles and hastily painted symbols on the floor. He looked thinner, his face gaunt and pale, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made Julia hesitate. His hands were smeared with paint, his clothes ragged, but he moved with purpose, adding the final strokes to a sprawling mural that covered the back wall. The mural was unlike anything Julia had ever seen. It depicted a vast, apocalyptic landscape, cities consumed by fire, rivers running red with blood, and a sky filled with shadowy figures descending from the heavens. At the center was a single figure of blinding light, holding a scroll in one hand and a sword in the other. The scroll was unrolled, its text a dizzying maze of names written in tiny, meticulous script. "Damien?" Julia called softly, her voice echoing in the empty space. He turned slowly, his paintbrush clattering to the floor. For a moment, he looked at her as though he didn't recognize her, but then his expression softened. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse. "I wasn't sure you would." Julia approached cautiously, her flashlight beam dancing across the eerie symbols on the floor. "What is all this?" she asked, gesturing to the mural and the candles. "Why did you run? You need help." Damien shook his head, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "Help? There's no help for me, Julia. They made that clear." "Who's they?" she pressed, her frustration mounting. "Damien, you're scaring people. You're scaring me." He sank to his knees, his hands trembling as he gestured toward the mural. "The Watchers," he said. "They're here, Julia. They've been here all along. I thought I could run, but you can't outrun judgment." Julia knelt beside him, her voice softening. "Then, why did they send you back? What do they want from you?" His eyes met hers, and she saw tears brimming in them. "They didn't send me back to save anyone," he said. "They sent me back to make them see, to warn them that the clock is ticking." Julia's pulse quickened. "What clock? What are we supposed to do?" Damien's voice broke as he spoke. "The scroll isn't just a list of names, Julia. It's a ledger. Every sin, every act of cruelty, every betrayal. It's all recorded. And when the last name is crossed off, it's over. They showed me what happens when the scroll is complete. The world doesn't burn. It's erased." Julia struggled to process his words, her rational mind fighting against the rising tide of fear. "If that's true," she said carefully, "then there has to be a way to stop it. Maybe that's why they sent you back, to change things." He laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and broken. "Change? Do you know how much blood is on my hands? How many lives I've destroyed? They didn't send me back to redeem myself. They sent me back as a warning, a living testament to what's coming." Before Julia could respond, a sudden gust of wind blew through the church, extinguishing the candles and plunging the space into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and a low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating in her chest. Damien stiffened, his eyes darting toward the mural. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're watching us." Julia's flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal the mural. For a split second, she thought she saw movement, shadows shifting within the painted figures as though they were alive. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and Julia felt a crushing weight settle over her, making it hard to breathe. "Damien," she shouted, grabbing his arm, "what's happening?" "They're showing us," he choked out. "They're showing us what's next." The mural seemed to ripple, the painted flames flickering like real fire. The figure of light at the center glowed brighter, its scroll unfurling further as the names continued to write themselves, one by one. Julia stared in horrified fascination, unable to look away. And then, just as suddenly as it began, The phenomenon ceased. The room was silent once more, the air heavy with the smell of burnt wax. Damien collapsed, his body trembling, and Julia caught him before he hit the floor. "They won't wait forever, Dar," he muttered, his voice faint. "The reckoning is coming." Julia held him tightly, her mind racing. She didn't understand what she had seen, but one thing was clear. Whatever Damien had been sent back to warn about was far from over, and the world might not be ready for what lay ahead. In the weeks following Damien Wolfe's disappearance from St. Mark's Church, the city seemed to fall under a strange, collective unease. The mural he had painted, its apocalyptic imagery burned into Julia Morales' memory, was covered by authorities shortly after her discovery. No one wanted to confront the implications of what it depicted. Public officials dismissed the entire incident as the delusions of a mentally unstable man, and religious leaders either condemned or ignored Damien's claims. But whispers persisted, growing louder with every strange event. Reports of unexplained phenomena increased. People across the city described vivid dreams of being watched, their actions scrutinized by faceless figures bathed in light. Shadows moved where there should have been none, and animals acted erratically, as though sensing an unseen presence. The more sensitive among the population, children, the elderly, those grappling with guilt or unresolved trauma, seemed to be the most affected. Some claimed to see glowing figures in the corners of their vision, figures that vanished the moment they turned to look. Julia, unable to shake her obsession with Damien's message, delved deeper into the mystery. The journalist in her sought clarity and answers, but there was also a personal stake she couldn't ignore. She had begun experiencing the same phenomena as the others. The vivid dreams, the shifting shadows, the oppressive sense of being watched. She hadn't seen Damien since the night at the church, but his words haunted her. They won't wait forever. The reckoning is coming. Her investigation took her to the fringes of society, where believers, conspiracy theorists, and doomsday preppers debated the meaning of Damien's message. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Some claimed to have deciphered hidden messages in his mural, linking it to ancient prophecies. Others dismissed the entire ordeal as an elaborate hoax or a viral marketing stunt for some upcoming apocalyptic movie. But one detail stood out. Reports of strange occurrences weren't limited to the city. Similar accounts were cropping up worldwide. Lights in the sky, mass animal migrations, and a growing unease among people who couldn't quite articulate what they were feeling. Julia finally caught a break when an anonymous email arrived in her inbox. The sender claimed to have seen Damien and provided coordinates to a remote cabin deep in the woods outside the city. The email was cryptic, warning her to come alone and to move quickly. Against her better judgment, she followed the lead. She packed a bag, grabbed her recorder, and drove out into the wilderness. The cabin was small and dilapidated, hidden among the towering pines. The air was still, the only sounds coming from the crunch of her boots on the gravel path and the occasional rustle of leaves. As she approached, she noticed faint light spilling through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. She knocked, her heart pounding. "Damien?" she called, her voice echoing in the silence. The door creaked open, and there he was. Damien looked worse than before, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken, his movements slow and deliberate. He stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. The inside of the cabin was cluttered with papers, sketches, and candles. A large map covered one wall, marked with pins and circles. Julia recognized some of the locations as sites of recent, unexplained phenomena. "You found me?" Damien said, his voice hoarse. "I wasn't sure you would." "You're not easy to track down," Julia replied, glancing around the room. "Why are you hiding?" He slumped into a chair, rubbing his temples. "I'm not hiding. I'm waiting. They told me to prepare, but they didn't say how. The Watchers are always there, watching me, watching everyone. But they've gone quiet. That's what scares me." Julia sat across from him, her recorder running. "Quiet? What do you mean?" Damien leaned forward, his eyes intense. "They were constant before, always in the corner of my vision, always whispering, always reminding me of what I'd done and what was coming. Now, they're just gone. Like they're waiting for something, like the decision's already been made." "The decision?" Julia asked, her voice trembling. "What decision?" He gestured to the map. "Look at the signs, the lights in the sky, the animals acting strange, the nightmares people are having. It's not just here, it's everywhere. Something's building, Julia. The scroll is almost complete." Julia stared at him, trying to reconcile his words with her rational mind. "You keep talking about the scroll. What does it mean? What happens when it's complete?" Damien's hands clenched into fists. "The list grows shorter every day. Names are being crossed off. People are dying, not just physically, but spiritually. Their sins weigh them down, and when their names disappear from the scroll, they're erased. Not just from life, but from existence. It's like they never were." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. "And what about the people who are left? What happens to them?" His gaze dropped to the floor. "I don't know. Maybe they're spared. Maybe they're judged last. But I don't think anyone escapes. Not really." The air in the cabin felt heavy, oppressive. Julia struggled to maintain her composure. "If this is true, then why you? Why did they send you back?" Damien looked up at her, his expression weary but resolute. "Because I'm the worst of us. I'm proof that no one is beyond judgment. They didn't send me back to save anyone. They sent me back as a warning." Before Julia could respond, the cabin lights flickered and a low hum filled the air. Damien froze, his eyes darting to the window. "They're here," he whispered. Julia turned to look, but saw nothing. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls and floor. The candles flickered, their flames stretching unnaturally high. Damien stood, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the door. "You need to leave," he said urgently. "Now." "I'm not leaving you," Julia insisted, standing her ground. "They're not here for me," Damien said, his voice trembling. "They're here for you." The words hit her like a physical blow. The hum grew deafening, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. Julia felt a presence behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing, just the oppressive weight of being watched. Damien grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Go!" he shouted. "Warn them, Julia. Tell them what's coming. It's the only chance they have." The door flew open, and a blinding light flooded the room. Julia shielded her eyes, but Damien didn't move. He stood there, his face illuminated, his expression one of resignation. "Run!" he screamed. Julia hesitated for only a moment before bolting out the door and into the forest. The hum followed her, a constant pulsing vibration that seemed to chase her through the trees. She didn't stop until she reached her car, her chest heaving, her hands shaking. When she looked back, the cabin was gone. Nothing but an empty clearing where it had stood. As she drove back to the city, Damien's final words echoed in her mind. Warn them. It's the only chance they have. She didn't know who would listen or if it would make a difference, but she knew she had to try. The reckoning was coming, and time was running out.